Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. What if the self, the one inside your head, isn't real? What if the voice narrating your life, the one that says, "I am me," is just a story the brain is telling itself? Tonight's story is about the unraveling of that story, the slow, strange death of the ego. If this kind of calm, mind-bending philosophy helps you relax, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. We post a new one every night. Also, let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to see which corners of the world are awake, quietly thinking. Now lean back, get comfortable. The illusion is about to dissolve. The idea of the self feels obvious. A person, a thinker, a watcher behind the eyes, something stable, continuous, real, but no philosopher ever found it. Not really. In fact, the more they looked, the less they saw. David Hume, the sharp Scottish empiricist, tried to find the self within himself. He peered inward, trying to detect a thinker behind the thoughts. But all he found was a flickering stream. A thought, then a sensation, then a memory, then an itch. The self, he realized, was nowhere. Just a bundle of perceptions, one after another, loosely tied with thread. He called it the bundle theory of the self, and it was deeply unsettling. Because what are we, if not the thread? And if there is no thread, only moments, then who is thinking this thought right now? Buddhism had already seen it, long before Hume, long before Freud. In the silence of ancient forests and the dust of forgotten temples, it was whispered, anatta, the doctrine of non-self. A radical insight that the self is a fabrication, a mistake of perception. In Buddhist thought, there are 5 aggregates that make up what we call a person: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. But none of them, on their own or combined, amount to a self. Imagine 5 pieces of wood. Does the pile become a boat? Only if the mind labels it so. But no plank has boatness. The label is convenience, not truth. The ego is the same, a name we give to an assembly of parts, changing moment by moment. Never stable, never still. And yet we grip it like a lifeline. We say, "I am angry," or "I am ashamed," as if a solid being possesses those feelings. But look closer. Is there an I outside the anger? Or is anger just happening, like a storm passing through a valley? The modern mind resists this. The West loves the self. It is sacred. It must be preserved, decorated, enhanced. Entire industries thrive on ego maintenance, self-image, self-help, self-care. But what if this whole idea is flawed? Not because we're worthless, but because there was no one to begin with. This is not nihilism. This is not despair. It's liberation. The self is a burden. It is always afraid of Yahweh, of death, of shame, of not being enough. But if there is no self, then there is nothing to defend. No mask to keep in place. No image to polish. This is why many who taste ego death describe it as freedom. Peace without identity. Just awareness. Just being. No one to impress. No one to disappoint. Just presence, soft and still. Psychology touches this too, though it dances around the fire. Split brain studies show something eerie. In patients with severed corpus callosums, the bridge between the 2 brain hemispheres, consciousness seems to split. One side of the brain speaks, the other sees. They act independently. One hand buttons the shirt, the other unbuttons it. One side denies what the other just saw. Who is in control? Which one is me? The illusion cracks, and we glimpse the truth. The self is not one thing. It is a committee, a swirling conversation between systems. And sometimes they don't agree. Even memory plays tricks. The self is often defined by memory, the story we tell about our past. But studies show that memory is malleable. We misremember constantly. And even when we remember correctly, it is coloured, filtered, edited. We do not recall life. We recreate it. So if the past is a fiction, and the self is built on that fiction, then what exactly are we defending when we say, I? Neuroscientist Thomas Metzinger said it bluntly: the self is a useful illusion, an interface, like the cursor on a screen. It helps us move through the world, make decisions, survive. But the cursor is not the computer. The ego is not the mind. It is just a point of control. Not a being, not a soul, just a trick. And the trick works until it doesn't. People who've had deep meditative experiences or taken certain psychedelics often describe the same thing: a sudden dissolving of the boundary between self and world. No more me watching, just light, sound, breath, experience, no one holding it, just the happening. And for a moment there is peace, not the peace of sleep, but the peace of disappearing. The ego fights this, it calls it death, it panics, but it's not death, it's truth. And it was there all along. There is no one behind the curtain, no little person pulling the strings. Just thought arising, sound arising, self arising and fading. Like mist, like fog, like a candle flickering in still air, one flame, then another, but never the same. So if the self is not real, why do we suffer so much defending it? Why are we so desperate to be seen, respected, remembered? Because we think the self is all we have. But maybe, just maybe, what we are is far wider, a field of experience, a wave in motion, something that can never be pinned down, but always is. The more we chase the self, the more we suffer. The more we observe gently, the more we see. Nothing was ever held, only flowing, only now. Let that idea rest in the silence. Let it drift softly in the air. There is no self to lose, and no self to protect, only awareness, only this breath, this thought, this warm and silent moment. What survives when the self dissolves? This is the quiet question that floats beneath all others, like a shadow beneath water. When the mask slips, when identity flickers and burns away, what remains? For centuries, mystics and philosophers have whispered that nothing remains, and that this nothing is not a void but a liberation. But to the ego, it feels like death. The ego is not evil. It's not a villain lurking in the mind. It's a pattern, a strategy, a survival mechanism that slowly came to believe it was the whole show. A house that thinks it's the earth, a mirror that forgets it reflects. And yet most of life is organised around protecting this illusion. Careers, reputations, bank accounts, even conversations are shaped by the need to defend a fragile image, a name, a narrative. But look closer and the story falls apart. The person known as you is different from the one who existed 5 years ago, not just in body but in mind, in memory, in belief. The cells have changed, the thoughts have changed, the preferences have shifted, and yet we say, that was me, as if there is one continuous thread tying it all together. But where is the thread? What does it look like? Is it in the brain, the body, the memories? What if it's just an echo we're mistaking for a voice? In psychology, this illusion is sometimes called the narrative self, a story constructed after the fact to make sense of scattered moments. The self explains why we did things, even when neuroscience shows we decided them before we were conscious of it. The brain acts, then invents a reason. The illusion is tidy, but the reality is messy. And buried inside that mess is something deeper than identity, something quieter. In Buddhist meditation, practitioners are trained to watch the self arise and vanish. A thought appears, a sensation flickers, a desire surges, and then it's gone. What's left is pure observation. No commentator, no judge, just the watching. Western psychology stumbles upon this too. The concept of observer consciousness, or metacognition, the ability to think about thinking, reveals that the part of the mind that watches is not the same as the part that speaks. Who is noticing the thought? Who is aware of the awareness? It slips away the moment you look directly, like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. Carl Jung believed the ego was only a small part of the psyche, like the tip of an iceberg. Beneath it lies the shadow, the anima, the collective, unconscious, a vast web of instincts, images and archetypes that shape behavior long before reason arrives. The ego wants to be in control, but the deeper mind is older, wilder, and not concerned with appearances. It doesn't care how you look on LinkedIn. It doesn't know what a resume is. It speaks in dreams, fears, impulses, and it laughs at the idea that the self is in charge. The neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga once described consciousness as the press secretary of the brain. Not the president, not the decision maker, just the one who explains things after they've already happened. This is not science fiction, it's cognitive science. The feeling of agency, of being a self who makes decisions, is a post hoc illusion. The brain acts, then tells a story, and we believe it, because we must. Without the story, things feel unglued, floating, and the ego hates floating. It wants ground, control, certainty. But the truth is we are closer to weather than we are to machines. Thoughts rise like clouds, emotions pass like rain. Identity is the shape of the wind through trees, different every second, never graspable. The self is not a statue, but a current, a process. This is why ego death is often described as terrifying. It's not just the loss of a name or a memory, it's the loss of solidity. The realization that the ground we've been standing on was never there. And yet, for those who've passed through it, ego death brings a strange peace. Because when there's no self to protect, everything softens. Criticism doesn't hurt as much. Praise doesn't inflate. There's no image to maintain. Just being, just breath, just sound. Think of the Japanese concept of mu, emptiness, non-being, the fertile void from which all things arise. In Zen, the self is like a finger pointing at the moon. Useful maybe, but don't mistake the finger for the moon. The finger is identity. The moon is experience, and most people never look past the finger. The philosopher Alan Watts compared the self to a flame, always burning, always changing, a pattern, not a thing. He said, trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth. The attempt is the problem. The trying is the trap, because the self can never see itself. Not directly. It is always out of reach, and maybe it's meant to be. In Hindu philosophy, the word Atman refers to the true self, but even here, it's not the personality, not the ego, it's the universal self, the drop of ocean that is also the ocean, the part that isn't a part. In the Advaita Vedanta tradition, the self is not destroyed, it's dissolved into everything. The illusion is separation, the truth is unity. The word individual comes from the Latin individuum, meaning indivisible. But we are not indivisible, we are divisible in every way. Thoughts contradict, desires clash, memories fragment, and still we insist, I. But what if the I is just a placeholder? A pronoun for a process? Something the mind says to glue things together, like using string to tie papers that were never meant to be one book. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz, once said that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space is our power to choose. But who chooses? What part of the mind decides? And is it really choosing, or just reacting with a delay? These questions don't have easy answers, but asking them softens the grip of certainty. They open the hand of the mind, and what slips through is not confusion, but freedom. When the self is no longer central, everything changes. Humility becomes natural. Compassion flows easier, because if there's no solid me, then the line between me and you is thinner, softer, maybe not real at all. The poet Rumi said, "Try to be like the night, soft and gentle." The ego says, be sharp, be strong, be someone, but the night doesn't try to be anything. It just is, and it holds everything, even the self, even its own disappearance. To believe in a fixed self is to live inside a museum exhibit that slowly rots behind glass. Stillness where there should be motion. A portrait painted in childhood, retouched in adolescence, framed in adulthood, and rarely questioned again. But nothing in the mind is still. Not truly. Personality is a story told in pencil, not stone. Yet people cling to it like a passport. They say, "I'm just not that kind of person." I've always been this way, as if the weather of the soul was immune to seasons. But every study in psychology whispers otherwise. The big 5 personality traits, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, are not stable. They shift, they bend. Even the trait called openness is not fixed. People become more closed, more cautious, more careful with time, or they open like late blooming flowers. Experiences change the patterns. Loss sharpens some, love softens others. Trauma can reshape the whole foundation, and yet we speak of the self as if it were a mountain, as if it were immune. It is not. It is a tide, and tides do not care about stories. One of the most famous experiments in social psychology was the Stanford Prison Experiment. It wasn't just about power, it was about identity. Volunteers, randomly assigned to play prisoners and guards, changed within days. The guards became cruel, the prisoners became passive, roles became reality, the mask fused with the face. This is the terrifying flexibility of the self. The same person can act like a saint in one context and a monster in another. Not because they are faking, but because the self adapts to survive. It is shaped by context, not carved from stone. And yet the ego resists this truth. It wants to be solid, predictable. It wants to say, "This is who I am." But who says that? And why do they need to? The need for identity often comes from fear. Fear of being forgotten, fear of being misunderstood, fear of disappearing. So the ego builds castles from habits. It says, "I'm the kind of person who," and fills in the blank with routines, rituals, preferences. But these are just comfort blankets, ego scaffolding. The reality is far stranger. In ancient Buddhist thought, the term dependent origination describes how all things, including the self, arise in dependence on conditions. Nothing exists independently. There is no self without sensation, no identity without memory, no me without you. The self is not a substance, it's a relation. It is not what we are, but how we appear. Like a rainbow, beautiful and vivid, but made entirely of light and perspective. You cannot touch it, you cannot hold it, but it still exists. And this is the paradox that dissolves certainty. Even in neuroscience, identity gets blurry. There are cases of people with brain injuries who undergo complete personality shifts. A calm man becomes violent. A religious woman becomes an atheist. The self is not preserved. It is rewritten by injury, by chemistry, by chance. And if chemicals can change the soul, then what is the soul made of? There's a condition called dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder, where entirely different selves exist within the same body. Different voices, different memories, even different handwriting. Who is the real one? The question begins to collapse, because all of them are real, and none of them are permanent. The philosopher Derek Parfit argued that personal identity doesn't matter in the way we think it does. What matters is psychological continuity. If tomorrow's version of you remembers today's experiences, shares your values, and feels connected to your story, then that's enough. There is no metaphysical thread, just a psychological resemblance. And if resemblance is all we have, then maybe the boundaries of the self are thinner than we imagined. Maybe the person we were yesterday is already gone. Maybe that's not tragic. Maybe that's a kind of freedom. Consider this. When someone says, "I've changed," we applaud. We admire growth. But when someone says, "I don't know who I am anymore," we panic. We treat it as a crisis. But both statements describe the same thing. Identity shifting, old narratives dissolving, the self moving like a river that never flows the same way twice. In therapy, people are often encouraged to find themselves. But maybe that's the wrong metaphor. Maybe the self isn't something hidden. Maybe it's something made, not found but created, moment by moment. And maybe peace comes not from discovering who we are, but from loosening our grip on who we think we have to be. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once said that despair is the sickness unto death. Not physical death, but the death of the self that cannot accept its own fluid nature. The self that clings to old identities even as life demands transformation. Despair for Kierkegaard is the refusal to become who we are. But who are we? The answer is never final. It cannot be, because to answer it is to freeze something that is alive. And life resists freezing. It melts boundaries. It blurs categories. Even the brain doesn't draw lines as clearly as we think. The default mode network, a set of brain regions active when we think about ourselves, lights up during daydreaming, planning, reflecting. But it also deactivates in moments of deep flow, intense presence, or meditation. When we are fully immersed, the sense of self disappears. Not metaphorically, literally, the brain turns it off. And we function better without it. We perform better without it. We suffer less without it. So why do we return to it so quickly? Why do we cling? Because the ego is addictive. It gives us the illusion of control. It makes the chaos feel manageable. It gives the mind something to hold on to in the dark. But sometimes, letting go is what frees us. Sometimes, the best thing the self can do is step aside. And in that stepping aside, something gentler takes its place. Not a person, not a character, just awareness, just stillness, just the quiet miracle of being without having to be someone. The self is an actor trapped in a role it cannot remember auditioning for. The costume changes over time. The script shifts, but the performance never stops. Day after day, the ego returns to the stage, reciting the lines it believes are necessary to survive. And yet, no one is watching. Not really. The audience is imagined. A jury in the mind's theatre, built from parents, peers, old teachers, ex-lovers, social media followers, and ghosts of who we thought we'd be by now. This is what the ego protects. Not truth, not essence, but performance. A version of self designed for applause and acceptance. But under that performance, something quieter breathes. Something older than the need to be seen. It does not care about reputation. It does not argue. It does not seek. It only watches, still and aware. It is what remains when the show ends. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." But what if the why we cling to is just a mask for the who? What if our reasons for living are all shaped by a self we don't understand? The philosopher Michel Foucault argued that identity is not something we discover, but something society constructs for us. Systems of power, education, religion, media, train us to think of ourselves in specific ways. We are students, workers, parents, citizens, each role with its expectations, rewards, and punishments. Break the role, and the system reacts. Step outside the script, and the silence becomes loud. This is why most people never question the self, because to question it is to risk exile, social death, and the ego cannot bear that. So it adapts, it conforms, it becomes whatever is safest. But safety is not truth. Safety is obedience, and the cost is authenticity. Jean-Paul Sartre called this bad faith, the act of lying to oneself to avoid the anxiety of freedom. We pretend we are fixed, that our roles define us, because to admit otherwise is terrifying. If nothing defines us, then anything is possible. And that much freedom can feel like drowning. But maybe it's not drowning, maybe it's swimming. Maybe the self is only heavy when we try to carry it. Letting go is lighter. Consider this: children have no fixed identity. They shift fluidly between roles, moods, desires. One moment they are a dragon, the next a doctor, the next sobbing over a broken crayon, and none of it is inconsistent. It's just experience moving freely. The ego hasn't crystallized yet, the identity hasn't hardened, and in that fluidity there is a kind of joy, a kind of truth. But then we grow up, and we're told to choose. Pick a path, be someone, settle down, stick to the story. And so we do, we say, I'm this kind of person. But what we're really saying is, this is the mask I've learned to wear. Carl Rogers, one of the founders of humanistic psychology, believed that most suffering comes from the gap between the real self and the ideal self, the person we are versus the person we think we should be. And the larger that gap, the deeper the discomfort. But what if both selves are illusions? What if there is no real or ideal, just layers of masks peeling away, revealing nothing solid underneath? That nothingness is not empty. It is full of potential, full of presence, full of the moment itself. The Tao Te Ching says, when I let go of what I am, I become what I might be. But to let go is to trust the fall, to surrender control, and the ego never wants to surrender. It wants to grip tighter, especially when it feels threatened. This is why ego death often feels like panic before it feels like peace. The mind screams as the boundaries dissolve. But what's really dying? Not life, not awareness, just the illusion of control. Just the mask, and beneath it, everything softens. In the practice of mindfulness, one of the most repeated instructions is to observe thoughts without identification. Not, I am anxious, but there is anxiety. Not, I am sad, but sadness is present. This small shift creates space. It shows that the self does not own the emotion. The emotion is just visiting, passing through, like weather, like a cloud, like a dream. And if emotions are not the self, then what is? The body? The brain? The memories? But memories change. The body ages. The brain forgets. Alzheimer's strips away identity piece by piece. And yet, even in the final stages, something watches. Something is there. Not a person, but presence. Not a name, but a feeling. Like music with no lyrics. Like light with no shape. In Hindu thought, the Atman, the true self, is described not as a person but as awareness itself. Not the content of consciousness, but consciousness without content. The silent witness. Always there, untouched by pain, untouched by thought, but covered by layers of illusion. Like the sun behind clouds. The sun doesn't change, only the clouds move. And in the same way, the true self never suffers. Only the ego does. Only the story. And yet we cling to that story with everything we have, because it feels like life, even when it hurts, even when it suffocates. But freedom is not comfort, it is clarity. It is the ability to see the illusion and not need it anymore. The ability to let it fall away and still feel whole. The poet Hafiz wrote, I wish I could show you when you are lonely or in darkness, the astonishing light of your own being. But that light is not the ego. It is what remains when the ego stops talking. When the performance ends, when the mind goes quiet, it is not found by striving, but by stillness. Not by thinking, but by noticing. Not by becoming, but by being. The journey is not upward, it is inward, and then downward, and then nowhere. Because the path disappears when the self disappears. And what's left is not a destination, it is a home. There is a strange comfort in pretending to be someone. A relief in playing the part, even when the lines don't fit. The world prefers consistency. It rewards predictability. It asks quietly but persistently for us to pick an identity and stay there. But beneath the surface, most people are shapeshifters. They adjust their tone for each room, their posture for each crowd. The self they present to friends is not the one they show their parents, their partner, their mirror, and yet they call it all me. They treat the shifting mask like a fixed face, but the cracks show eventually, in loneliness, in dreams, in the quiet moments when the noise of expectation falls away. That's when the real question slips in. Who am I when no one is looking? And the answer is usually silence, because without an audience, the ego loses its script. It doesn't know what to perform. And in that absence, we glimpse something rare, a flicker of truth, the truth that the self isn't one thing. It's many, a collage, a costume, a collection of voices pretending to be a choir. The psychologist Heinz Kohut once wrote about the fragmented self, not in pathological terms, but as a reality of human experience, that the self is not a monolith, but a series of selves orbiting a common center, sometimes aligned, sometimes in conflict, and often unaware of each other. We see this in contradiction, in how someone can be generous and cruel in the same day, brave and cowardly, honest and manipulative. The ego tries to smooth these rough edges. It edits the contradictions out of memory. It creates a narrative that flatters itself, but the contradictions remain, and they whisper at night. Carl Jung called this the shadow, the part of ourselves we hide, repress, or deny, not because it is evil, but because it is inconvenient, the parts that don't match the story we want to tell. But the more we reject the shadow, the more it controls us. The more we disown parts of ourselves, the more we project them onto others. We say, he's selfish, because we can't face our own greed. We call others weak to avoid our own fear. The shadow doesn't disappear. It waits, it watches, and eventually it surfaces, often in anger, often in regret, often too late. Integrating the shadow is not about becoming someone new. It's about realizing there was never someone fixed to begin with, that the self is a negotiation between light and dark. And peace comes not from choosing a side, but from holding both. The philosopher Heraclitus said, "Character is destiny." But what is character, if not a pattern of self-deceptions we've learned to wear? Even moral traits, kindness, courage, discipline, are context-dependent. The same person can be a hero in one moment and a coward in the next. Not because they changed, but because the self is not stable. It reacts, it adapts, it performs, and then it forgets. The brain helps in this forgetting. It fills memory with edits. It smooths over contradiction. It tells the story it needs to maintain a sense of identity. And so we remember being more consistent than we were. We remember being the same person all along. But that person is fiction. Useful maybe, but fiction. Like a dream we refuse to wake from. Buddhism points to this directly. The idea of emptiness in Mahayana tradition does not mean nothingness. It means that nothing exists independently, including the self. All things are empty of inherent essence. They arise from causes and conditions. They are not fixed. They are not separate. This includes the mind. This includes identity. When a thought arises, it feels personal. But where did it come from? Did we choose it? Did we author it? Or did it just appear shaped by memory, language, mood? The illusion of authorship is one of the ego's last tricks. It says, "I am thinking," but the thought arrives before the I claims it, and often it contradicts the thought that came before. So who is thinking? Neuroscience shows that decisions are often made in the brain before we become conscious of them. Libet's experiments in the 1980s revealed a delay. Our conscious awareness comes after the brain has already prepared to act. We are not the initiators, we are the narrators, and even then, unreliable ones. The self tells the story, but it doesn't write the script, it only reads it aloud, and sometimes skips the parts it doesn't like, yet we build entire lives around this narrator. We defend it, we promote it, we fear its disappearance. But what if the disappearance is not death? What if it's awakening? What if the self is not the center of the story, but a character in it? One of many, a guest in the house of consciousness. Not the owner, not the builder, just a voice sitting at the table. In Japanese Zen, there is a koan. Show me your original face before your parents were born. It is not a riddle to be solved. It is a mirror to be stared into. A way to dissolve the mask. To sit with the mystery of self. Not as something to define, but as something to observe. The ego wants answers. The soul only needs silence, because in silence there is no one to impress. No image to protect. Just breath. Just awareness. Just the slow unraveling of illusion. And beneath it all, something tender remains. Not a self, not an identity, but a presence, a softness, like moonlight on still water. Unnamed, unclaimed, free. There is something quietly terrifying about how easy it is to forget oneself. In moments of rage or lust or grief, the calm narrator disappears, and something ancient takes its place. A different voice, a different posture. We say later, I wasn't myself, but rarely ask who stepped in. Was it the shadow? The unconscious? A primitive instinct wearing the mask of agency? Or was it always part of the self we deny? The mind is a house with many rooms. Most people live in just one. The tidy front room with photographs on the wall, carefully arranged furniture, pleasant lighting. But deep in the back are rooms we never enter. Dusty basements, filled with memories we've edited, urges we've shamed, voices we've silenced. And when the door creaks open, we flinch. We call it a breakdown, a lapse, a bad day. But really, it's just the house trying to introduce itself. The self is not one room. It is the entire building. And peace only comes when we stop pretending the basement isn't part of the home. In Jungian terms, individuation is the process of becoming whole. Not perfect, not good, but whole. That means meeting the selves we hide. The angry child, the jealous lover, the fearful parent, the bitter competitor. Not to judge them, not to feed them, but to say, you live here too. Most people never do this. They live like landlords with no keys, frightened of their own hallways. And yet they wonder why the lights flicker, why the dreams grow strange, why the mirror feels unfamiliar. It's because the self they think they are is only a tenant, a role, a temporary arrangement built on habit and reward. Strip away the habits, and who is left? Strip away the roles, mother, artist, leader, survivor, and what remains? Something breathes beneath it all. Not a thing, not a name, just awareness. Just the candle that sees the room, even when the room denies its own shadows. The philosopher Thomas Metzinger was blunt. The self is a hallucination, a useful one, a model the brain builds to navigate the world. But like all models, it simplifies, it edits, it leaves out what doesn't serve the narrative. And so we believe in a solid me because the model says it's there, but try to find it, really look, and it dissolves, thought by thought, layer by layer, until all that's left is the watcher, the one who is not a person, not a thought, not a voice, but the space where all voices echo. Ancient spiritual traditions knew this long before neuroscience. In Vedantic philosophy, the self is not the ego, but the witness, called Sakshi. It is not involved in action. It is not touched by joy or suffering. It watches, it remains. It does not speak, but it sees. And when identity falls apart, it is what survives. The ego dies 1,000 times in a life. It dies when a relationship ends, when a belief collapses, when a job disappears. Each time we say, I don't know who I am anymore, but something keeps going, something walks forward, something stays alive even as the name on the door changes. That is not the ego, that is the light behind the costume. In Taoist thought, the way, or Tao, is what flows when we stop forcing things. The self that tries to control, to define, to achieve, that self is the source of resistance. But the Tao does not resist. It moves like water. It fills what is empty. It shapes itself to the world. The sage does not cling to a self. They let it go, again and again. And in the letting go, they find harmony. The modern world punishes this. It tells us to build a brand, to stand out, to declare our identity in bold letters. Social media turns the self into a performance, an algorithmic mask fed by likes and hearts and views. We become curators of a self-image that must be maintained, updated, validated. But who is it for? Who are we performing for at 2 a.m. when the screen goes dark? The ego whispers that this matters, that we are only real if we are seen. But the truth is quieter. We are never more real than when no one is watching. Because then the performance ends. Then the self rests. Then we return to the silence we've been running from. In that silence is something soft, something human. Not perfect, not grand, but real. Just breath. Just the sensation of being. Not doing. Not proving. Just existing. The psychologist Carl Rogers spoke of unconditional positive regard, the idea that we can only grow when we are accepted without conditions. But most people never offer this to themselves. They attach worth to roles, achievements, traits. I am good if I'm successful. I am lovable if I'm kind. But these are conditions. These are traps. The moment the condition slips, so does the worth. But what if we were never unworthy to begin with? What if the need to earn love was a lie the ego told to stay useful? The child doesn't earn worth. The sky doesn't earn its right to shine. They just are. And maybe we are too. Maybe all the trying was a distraction, a loop, a way to avoid the fear that we are already enough. Not as a person, not as a character, but as presence itself, as awareness that needs no label, no approval, no applause, just this moment, just this breath, just this being. When the ego dissolves, the world changes. Not because the world is different, but because the filter is gone. The judgments, the comparisons, the stories, they fall away. And what's left is raw, unfiltered, beautiful. Not in a poetic sense, but in a deeply real one. The kind of beauty that doesn't need an audience. The kind that exists in stillness, in ordinary things. A leaf, a crack in the sidewalk, a sigh in the dark. This is the beginning of freedom. Not a grand revolution, just a gentle shift. From being someone to simply being. There's a strange thing that happens when a person stares long enough into their own mind. The lines begin to blur. The voice that narrates thoughts starts to feel less like a speaker and more like an echo. The more one watches it, the less solid it becomes. Like mist when walked through, like a face seen through water. Meditation reveals this slowly, not with fireworks, but with a steady erosion. At first, there's still a sense of self sitting behind the eyes, the observer, the thinker. But then the observation turns inward, and the question arises, who is watching the watcher? The search spirals, and in the spiraling, the ego panics, because it can't answer without pretending, without guessing, without inventing something plausible. The self cannot point to itself without drawing a circle in sand and calling it eternal. This is the oldest trick in the mind, the illusion that because we remember our life as a story, there must be a storyteller. But memory is not a book, it is a collage, a rearranged library of fragments, constantly edited and refiled by mood, context, and need. Neuroscience confirms this unsettling truth. Memory is not retrieval, it is reconstruction. Each time we remember something, we alter it, we rewrite it. The story of me is revised every day, often without our awareness. So who is remembering? And what is real? The Buddhist teacher Ajahn Chah once said, "You see the river, but you don't see the flow." That's what identity is, a river mistaken for a stone, a movement mistaken for a thing. But most people will rather cling to the illusion. Not because they are stupid, but because they are tired. Tired of uncertainty, tired of change. The self promises comfort, even if it's a lie. But a comforting lie, repeated long enough, becomes culture. And culture reinforces identity at every turn. It says this is who you are. This is your history, your name, your side. And to question it is to betray it. But betrayal is not always wrong. Sometimes it is necessary. Sometimes the only way to find the truth is to break the story. To step out of the line and ask, what if I am not this? It's a question that monks have asked for thousands of years. It's the seed of liberation, but also of exile. Because to step outside the narrative is to become strange, untethered. In Zen they say, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The world doesn't change, but the self that moves through it is no longer holding on. It is not identified with the labour, not defined by the repetition. The ego would have you believe that suffering only ends when the world bends to your will. But the awakened mind knows that suffering ends when identification stops. When pain is just pain, not a personal failure. When fear is just fear, not a flaw. When loss is just change, not punishment. This detachment is not cold. It is not apathy. It is warmth without clutching, love without possession, presence without obsession. The philosopher David Hume famously declared that when he looked inward, he found no self, just perceptions, sensations, thoughts passing like actors on a stage, no central observer, just the stage itself. He called the self a bundle of perceptions, and he was dismissed by many for this. Too radical, too empty, but he was right, not because he had a mystical vision, but because he paid attention without pretense. And the truth revealed itself in silence, the same truth that sages and monks and mystics have pointed to for millennia, that there is no solid I, no fixed self, only a process, a flickering, a dance. But we've built a civilization on the opposite idea. Laws, religions, institutions, all depend on a solid self who makes choices, owns property, sins, repents, redeems. What happens when that foundation cracks? When we realize the self is not a noun, but a verb, it doesn't collapse everything. It reveals something deeper. Responsibility doesn't vanish. It becomes clearer. Compassion doesn't fade. It expands. Because if the self is not solid, then others aren't either. And we are all caught in the same dream, the same flux, the same ache. This is not nihilism. It is intimacy. It is the understanding that nothing is separate, that when a stranger cries, a part of us cries too, that when a bird sings, it is not singing to us or for us, it just sings, and we are lucky enough to hear it. But the ego wants meaning. It wants specialness. It says, I must be important, but the wind doesn't care who is listening. The stars don't perform for an audience. The mountain doesn't bow to kings. And yet, they are beautiful. Not because they try, but because they are free. This is the lesson the ego refuses to learn. That meaning is not something earned or proven. It is something seen, something noticed, in silence, in stillness, in the space between breaths. And in that space, the self dissolves. Not in pain, not in fear, but in awe, because what remains is not absence, it is presence. It is the light that was always there, flickering behind the curtain. The self is the curtain. Pull it back, and the world floods in. Not as a story, but as a song. And for once, we don't need to sing along. We can just listen. The ego doesn't fear death. It fears irrelevance, to be alive and unseen, to be breathing but forgotten. That is what haunts most people at night, even if they don't say it aloud. That quiet ache in the chest isn't always pain. Sometimes it's the sound of a self unraveling in the absence of validation. The truth is the self is built not from facts but from attention. What others reflect back to us becomes the scaffolding we climb. If no one mirrors us, we feel like ghosts, and so we perform. Not out of malice, out of necessity. We post, we speak, we exaggerate, we conform, we signal, hoping someone will look long enough to convince us we exist. This isn't vanity, it's a survival strategy, a way for the fragile self to stitch itself together in public. But what happens in solitude? When the lights are off and the mirror says nothing, that's when the ego begins to whisper again. It asks, without them, who are you? And the answer, if honest, is usually silence, because we've built the self like a house of cards, always leaning on someone else's gaze. The psychologist Charles Cooley called it the looking glass self, the idea that we see ourselves through the imagined judgment of others. Not who we are, but who we think others think we are. It's a loop of mirrors, each reflecting an echo, never a face. And in that loop, authenticity becomes almost impossible. Because how can we be real if we're always adjusting for someone else's eyes? The philosopher Martin Heidegger had a word for this, das Man, the they self, the part of us that defers to the crowd, that lives not as an individual, but as a generic placeholder. We say what is expected, we think what is acceptable, and we lose ourselves in the fog of what others might approve. This is not life, this is imitation, and it leads to a quiet kind of despair. Not loud, not cinematic, just a numbness, a sense that something is missing, even when everything looks fine on the outside. Because the ego has fed itself on applause, and applause is not nourishment, it's noise, loud, fast, hollow noise, and when it stops we feel hungry again. But we don't know for what. This is the sickness of modern selfhood, inflated, curated, and starving. We were not meant to live like this. The ancient Stoics knew this well. Epictetus taught that most suffering comes not from events, but from our judgments about them, and those judgments are often tangled with identity. This happened to me. I am a victim. I am a failure. But remove the I, and what remains? Just the event, just the feeling, just a passing moment. Marcus Aurelius, writing by candlelight in his tent during war, reminded himself over and over, you are a soul. Carrying a corpse, it was not morbid, it was clarifying. The body is not the self, the thoughts are not the self, even the name is not the self. What, then, is left? Something still. Something that watches even when everything else falls apart. That watching presence is not what the ego calls me. It has no name, no story, no age. It is the eye of the storm, untouched by the storm. And in moments of deep crisis, grief, heartbreak, near death, that presence sometimes becomes visible. The ego collapses and what's left is real. Not dramatic, not holy, just real. Like the air returning after holding your breath too long. But the ego comes back quickly. It rebuilds the story. It says, that was intense. I'm changed now. And the new identity forms, just as rigid as the last. Enlightenment becomes another mask. Humility becomes another performance. The self reinvents itself as a spiritual being. But the watching presence does not need a title. It is not spiritual. It is not secular. It is not interested in identity. It is only interested in truth. And truth does not wear costumes. It is plain. It is silent. It is the sound of one's own breath in the dark, when nothing needs to be said. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus is quoted as saying, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." That within is not personality, it is not opinion, it is the quiet flame that flickers beneath all masks, the one that doesn't burn for attention but for light itself, and when we ignore it, we feel lost, because no matter how many selves we create, none of them can replace that original flame. Not fully. They can only distract from it. They can only delay the return, and eventually everyone must return. To the silence, to the watching, to the presence that existed before the name, before the face, before the idea of self even took shape. That return is not easy. It requires shedding, releasing, undoing. But it is not death. It is waking up, waking from the dream of being someone, an opening to the reality of simply being. To truly understand the illusion of self, one must first observe how desperately the mind tries to avoid that understanding. It distracts, it argues, it invents metaphors, It creates stories of reincarnation, or soul journeys, or personal destinies, not out of clarity, but out of fear. Fear of being nothing. But nothingness is misunderstood. It is not absence, it is openness. It is the space that allows form to arise. Without it, there is no room to breathe, no place for change. The self resists this truth, because it cannot stand not being central. And yet, everything in nature contradicts this. Trees do not identify with their leaves. When autumn comes, they let go. Rivers do not mourn the water they lose. Clouds do not hoard their shape. Nature moves without ego, without clinging, and in doing so, remains alive. But humans cling. The child clings to approval. The adult clings to narrative. The elder clings to memory. And at each stage, the self says, "This is who I am," but it never is. Because as soon as the clinging stops, a different self appears. One shaped by grief, one shaped by joy, one shaped by silence. And the old self dissolves, unceremoniously, like breath leaving a room. Consider the idea of psychological flexibility, the ability to adapt to change, to shift perspectives, to update beliefs. It is one of the strongest predictors of mental health, and yet it is the enemy of the ego, because the ego wants certainty. It wants to say, "This is my truth," and never question it again. But truth, if it lives at all, lives in motion. It grows, it stretches, it breaks and reforms, and the self that refuses to evolve becomes a prison. Viktor Frankl, survivor of the concentration camps and founder of logotherapy, spoke of meaning as something one discovers, not inherits. He watched as people lost everything, including identity, and yet still found meaning, not in their stories, not in their past, but in how they faced the present moment, in how they chose to respond when nothing else was left. This choosing is not the act of a fixed self, it is the act of presence. The self, as we often think of it, is obsessed with origins, childhood wounds, ancestral lines, personality types. But presence doesn't care how something began. It only asks, what is happening now? And in that question, identity becomes irrelevant. Because what matters is the seeing, not the seer. What matters is the action, not the actor. Shakespeare understood this. His characters often broke the fourth wall, speaking directly to the audience, confessing their confusion, their shifting motives, their inner contradictions. In doing so, they revealed something profound, that selfhood is theatrical, a performance within a performance, and we are both actor and audience, watching ourselves pretend to be consistent. But deep down, we know. We know that the me who argues in traffic is not the me who cries during a song, that the me who dreams of greatness is not the me who struggles to get out of bed. And yet, we stitch these fragments together, hoping no one notices the seams. But the seams are sacred. They are the proof that we are not one thing. They are the space through which the light gets in, as Leonard Cohen wrote. And if we stop hiding them, we might stop hiding from ourselves. The practice of self-inquiry, as taught by Ramana Maharshi, is deceptively simple. Ask, "Who am I?" and follow the question, not the answer. Not to find a label, but to exhaust the search. Because every answer, "I am a writer," "I am a mother," "I am spiritual," is just another costume. And when all costumes fall, something still breathes, something without name, without shape, just this, just now, just being. It doesn't care what job you have, it doesn't care how old you are, it doesn't care what you've done, because it isn't made of doing, it's made of noticing, of stillness, of the space that holds it all. The Upanishads describe it as neti neti, not this, not that. It cannot be grasped because it is not a thing. It cannot be destroyed because it was never born. It is not the wave, it is the ocean. And we suffer because we confuse the two. We try to hold the wave, to name it, to preserve it, but it was never meant to be held. It was meant to rise, crest and return. Just like every version of the self, rise, crest, return. The self is not the truth, it is the ripple. The truth is what the ripple dances on. And to know that, not as an idea, but as an experience, is to be free. Not in a loud, triumphant way, but in a soft, almost invisible way. The way clouds are free. The way silence is free. The way light moves, without needing permission. That kind of freedom cannot be earned. It can only be remembered. The mind loves categories. It wants to label everything. Good, bad, smart, stupid, right, wrong, me, not me. But what if the deepest truths live in the spaces between those labels? What if the essence of who we are isn't found in any category, but in the quiet refusal to be contained by one? The ego hates this idea. It thrives on boundaries. It defines itself by exclusion, by what it is not. I am not lazy. I am not like them. I am not my parents. It builds identity like a fortress, with walls of memory and guard towers of belief. But inside that fortress, the soul grows restless. Because the walls keep out danger, yes, but they also keep out change. And without change, we rot. Even the most sacred self-image becomes a cage when it cannot evolve. This is why so many people feel trapped in lives that look fine on paper. Because their identity is no longer alive. It's a photograph, a statue, a memory pretending to be a person. Alan Watts once said, "The reason you want to be better is the reason why you aren't." That sounds harsh, but it points to something crucial. The endless pursuit of self-improvement is often just the ego's way of avoiding self-discovery. If we're always chasing a better version of ourselves, we never have to meet the one who's here now. And the one who's here now might be flawed, might be tired, might be confused, but they're real. And that reality, raw as it is the doorway to everything deeper. True transformation doesn't begin with striving. It begins with surrender, with saying, "I don't know who I am," and sitting with that, letting it ache, letting it melt, until the ache becomes silence, and the silence becomes peace. Not the peace of perfection, but the peace of being nothing in particular. That's terrifying for the ego, because the ego thinks if it isn't something, it's nothing. But there's a third option, to be everything, not in a grand inflated sense, but in a quiet, receptive one. To be the sky that holds every cloud, to be the canvas, not the painting, the awareness, not the thought. This is what the mystics meant when they spoke of union, of dissolving into the all, not disappearing, but remembering. Remembering that the self was always a wave in the ocean, never separate from it, just temporarily convinced otherwise. This illusion isn't a mistake, it's part of the game. The self develops for good reasons, survival, communication, culture. But like training wheels, it must fall away when balance is found. If we cling too long, the training becomes limitation. We become unable to move without it. And movement is life. Consider the phenomenon of role confusion. When someone loses their job, or a relationship ends, or a child leaves home, and suddenly they feel empty, not just sad, disoriented, as if they've lost not just a role, but a self. This is because the identity was fused to the role, and when the role died, the self seemed to die with it. But this is an opportunity, not a tragedy, an invitation to see that the role was never the essence. It was a costume, and now without it, something new can emerge, something closer to truth, but only if we stop rushing to replace it with another costume. Silence must be honoured. The in-between is sacred. That space where one self dissolves and another hasn't yet formed, that's where depth lives. That's where we meet ourselves beyond definition. The poet Rilke called this living the questions. He wrote, "Try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms." That's what identity work really is. Not answering who we are, but learning to sit with not knowing. Learning to be gentle with the unraveling. To watch the masks fall and not panic. To grieve them even. Because some of them protected us. Some of them helped us survive. And it's okay to thank them as they go. This is not about ego death. in the violent, dramatic sense. It's not about destroying the self, it's about outgrowing it, like a snake shedding skin, like a tree letting go of leaves. Not because it's wrong, but because it's time. Because life moves, and we must move too, but not toward a new image, toward no image, toward the mirror with nothing in it, and still, somehow, everything. There is a stillness that waits behind every mask, and it does not care who wears it. It has no opinion, no story, no memory to defend. It simply watches. This watcher has been with us since birth, but we rarely notice it, too busy being someone, too busy constructing a narrative to protect us from the void. But the void was never the enemy. The enemy was the illusion of solidity, the belief that there must be a core, a fixed, unchanging self beneath all the thoughts and roles and moods. But the deeper one looks, the more the layers dissolve. Who is the self that's angry in traffic? Who is the self that dreams of fame at 3 a.m? Are they the same person, or just passing clouds pretending to be the sky? We are told from childhood that we must find ourselves, as if the self were a buried object waiting to be uncovered. But maybe there's nothing to find. Maybe there's only something to drop, and in the dropping we see what was always underneath: silence. Not emptiness in the bleak sense, but in the open sense, a spaciousness, a calm, a permission to not be anything. Imagine the freedom in that. To not be successful, to not be interesting, to not be right, just to be. The ego doesn't know how to handle this. It wants to be known, named, praised. It builds endlessly, achievements, personas, opinions. But all of it rests on a fundamental insecurity, the fear that without a story, we are nothing. Yet nothing is where peace lives. Not nothing as negation, but nothing as origin. The blank page, the clear sky, the moment before the wave rises. This is not theoretical. This is felt in meditation, in heartbreak, in awe, moments where the self falls away and something vaster takes its place. A still presence that doesn't need to speak, that just sees. The Sufi poet Rumi wrote, "Try to be a non-being, and be like the non-existent one. Then you may be said to truly exist." This sounds like madness to the rational mind, but it is not madness. It is the undoing of illusion, the illusion that the self is solid, separate, permanent. Nothing in nature behaves this way. A tree does not cling to last year's leaves. A river does not try to hold its current. But the ego clings to identity, like its life itself. It confuses habit with truth, repetition with reality. But if we trace any part of our identity back far enough, gender, nationality, beliefs, we find stories, not facts, not essence, just stories, handed down, repeated, believed, and eventually mistaken for self. Even the idea of my thoughts is misleading. Where did the thoughts come from? Did we choose them? Or did they arise from culture, memory, emotion, instinct? The Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh often said, "This is not me, this is not mine. I am not this not as rejection, but as freedom. Freedom from mistaking the wave for the ocean, from confusing the dance for the dancer. But this freedom requires courage. Because when the old self starts to fall away, there's a panic. Like stepping off a ledge with no ground in sight. The ego screams. It says you're losing yourself. And in a way, it's right. But what's being lost is the mask. What's being lost is the need to be anything. And in that space, what emerges is not a better self, but a lighter one, a quieter one. One that doesn't argue with life, that doesn't resist what is. Because resistance is the ego's armor. It tightens around fear, around pain, around change. But when we let go of the need to be a certain way, the armor softens, and the heart can breathe. The psychologist Carl Jung said, "We don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." That darkness is often the parts of ourselves we disown. The anger, the jealousy, the fear. But more subtly, the darkness is also the space beneath the self. the not knowing, the groundless ground. And making it conscious doesn't mean explaining it. It means feeling it, sitting with it, not running from it. And in doing so, we find something deeper than identity. We find presence, awareness, being. These words are imperfect. They point, but they don't contain. Because the truth they gesture toward isn't a concept, it's an experience. One that cannot be owned or taught, only recognized. Like a melody you've heard before, but can't remember where. It's familiar, ancient, and when you rest in it, everything gets quiet. Not dead, not numb, just quiet, like the earth after fresh snow. Like a breath that doesn't need to be held anymore. This is what lies beyond the self, not heaven, not nirvana, just this, just the part of you that never needed a name. Every lie the ego tells is for its own survival, not to deceive others, but to preserve the illusion of continuity. It says, I am the same person I was 10 years ago, but the truth is that person is gone, not in a poetic way, gone in the same way a flame is gone after it flickers out. The body changes, the memories reshape, the beliefs evolve or collapse. Even the voice sounds different in recordings. And yet the ego insists, this is me. But what is me exactly? A name, a face, a cluster of preferences? What if those preferences were handed down, not chosen? What if the music loved most was just what was heard during a fragile moment? What if the food that feels like home is simply what was fed during childhood grief? The ego takes these associations and says, this is who I am. But it's not identity, it's conditioning. And the deeper we look, the more we see the self as an echo chamber. Thoughts about thoughts, feelings about feelings, a loop with no original sound. David Hume realized this centuries ago. He searched for the self and found only perceptions. Never a thinker behind the thought, just thought. Never a seer behind the sight, just seeing. He concluded unsettlingly that the self is a fiction, a mental habit. But rather than despair, we can find freedom in this. Because if the self is a habit, it can be unlearned, or at least held lightly. Imagine waking up and not rushing to remember who you are, not rehearsing the narrative, just sitting with what is here now. The weight of the blanket, the sound of the rain, the breath, slow and invisible, no need to be anyone. Just this, just now. This is not detachment in the cold sense, it's intimacy, the kind that sees through the costume and loves anyway. The kind that says, you don't have to perform today. But the ego resists. It says, without a story, how will I survive? But it's not about survival, it's about stillness. The kind of stillness that watches a candle flicker without naming the flame. That watches a tear fall without needing to explain. This is the territory of the mystic, but also the territory of the real. Because the modern world does not reward presence, it rewards production. Identity becomes a tool for selling, branding, networking. Even healing gets packaged, another version of the self to display. I am someone who overcame. I am someone who grew. And while there is value in growth, there is danger in making it a badge. Because the moment healing becomes part of the ego, it stops being healing. It becomes armor. A way to say, look at me now. But true healing is invisible. It's the quiet shift that doesn't need to be named. It's the sigh that escapes when no one's watching. The loosening, the softening, the forgiveness that doesn't come with a post. And it only comes when the self steps aside. When it no longer needs to be seen, praised, or even known. Just held. Just breathed. Buddhism calls this anatta, non-self, not as a belief, but as a seeing, a realization that there's no solid entity at the center. Just processes, just change, just rising and falling. And in that rising and falling, everything is allowed. The anger, the joy, the numbness, the longing. Nothing needs to be resisted. Because there's no self to protect, no image to maintain, only this movement, this pulse, this wave. And when seen clearly, it becomes beautiful. Not in a decorative way, in a holy way, sacred because it's fleeting, sacred because it's free. And in this freedom, love becomes possible. Not the love that says, you complete me, but the love that says, you are already whole. A love not between two identities, but between two spaces, two silences, two winds passing through the same field. This kind of love doesn't cling. It doesn't need, it simply is. Like the sky holding the birds, like the earth holding the rain, like awareness holding everything without asking it to stay. The ego cannot love like this. It loves with fear, with contracts, with performance, but presence loves without needing anything back. And in that, it finds peace. Peace not as escape, but as arrival. Finally here, finally not trying to be more, just this, just this. To witness the self clearly is to watch it squirm beneath the light of awareness, shifting, disguising, narrating. It never stops moving, never rests in silence, because silence is its undoing. The ego survives by speaking. It constructs reality through commentary, endless inner monologues pretending to be truth. It says, this is who I am. This is what I believe. This is what I deserve. But none of these are stable. None of them endure. They mutate with emotion, with age, with memory, with fatigue. A person who once believed they were confident can crumble with a single failure. A person who believed they were kind can snap under pressure. So who is the real self? The confident one? The cruel one? The fearful one? The brave one? The answer is yes, all of them. And none of them. Because they arise and pass like weather. Like masks picked up for a scene, then dropped backstage. What remains when the mask falls? That is the question no identity can answer. Because the answer is not verbal. It is not an idea, it is an experience. The experience of presence without story. Not, I am present, but simply presence. No label, no owner, just this, just now. And this presence is not passive. It is alive. It listens without judging. It sees without naming. It breathes without clinging. In many contemplative traditions, this is the ground of being, the place before thought, the space that holds thought, feeling, sensation. And from this space, compassion arises, not as a virtue, but as a fact. Because when the self dissolves, the boundary between self and other dissolves too. Suffering is no longer their problem. It is just suffering, and the heart responds. Not because it should, because it must, because the walls are gone. But the ego resists this. It says, if I don't protect myself, I'll disappear. But what disappears is not the self. It's the illusion of separateness. And in its place, something vast appears, something without name. The Tao Te Ching calls it the nameless. It says the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. Because names divide, names draw lines. And truth lives beyond the lines, beyond the categories, beyond the maps. The philosopher Krishnamurti once said, the ability to observe without evaluating is the highest form of intelligence. And to observe the self without evaluating it is to watch a river flow without needing to control it. To let it rush, eddy, calm, disappear, and still be whole, still be aware, still be here. This does not mean abandoning the world, it means entering it fully, without armor, engaging from presence, not persona, speaking from stillness, not from script. Imagine a conversation with no performance, no defense, no desire to impress, just listening, just responding, just being. That is possible when the self loosens, when it no longer needs to be liked or right or understood, when it is content to vanish into the moment, not as loss, as liberation. But this isn't taught, not in school, not in culture. We are taught to assert identity, to defend it, to market it. Be yourself becomes a commandment, but no one explains what the self is. Because if they did, the whole structure might tremble. Because the self is not stable. It is not discoverable. It is not a pearl in the center of the oyster. It is the play of waves on the surface of the sea. And the sea does not care what the waves look like. It just is. and so are we, but we forget. We forget because we are taught to forget, taught to compare, to compete, to curate. And in the process, we lose contact with the simplicity of being, but it is always here, beneath the roles, beneath the voice in the head, beneath the striving and the shame. It waits, it watches, it loves, not as a person, as a presence. And the moment we stop trying to be someone, we start to remember. The most convincing illusion is the one no one ever questions, the belief that there must be someone here experiencing all of this, someone behind the eyes, behind the thoughts, behind the choices, pulling the strings like a quiet conductor. But when looked at directly, the conductor disappears. There are thoughts but no thinker, actions but no doer. Just as a flame flickers without needing a central flame master, the mind moves without a self behind it. But we cling. Not because the self is true, but because it is familiar. It comforts like a worn-out coat, full of holes and stories. And even when it chokes us, we hesitate to take it off. Because who are we without our stories? The one who was hurt, the one who overcame, the one who failed, the one who tried. Even our suffering becomes identity. It's subtle, a badge worn quietly, trauma as gravity, shame as glue. And yet, what if none of it was ours? Not really. What if the pain happened, but the me that it happened to doesn't exist the way we think? This isn't denial, it's clarity. The pain is real, the memory is real. But the idea that it belongs to a solid, continuous self is fiction. Neuroscientists have searched for the self in the brain and found no single location. The default mode network lights up during self-referential thinking, but it's a pattern, not a person. Like a song playing on repeat, not a singer. There is no core, only choreography, a beautiful, dizzying dance of neurons firing, stories forming, identities emerging and fading. The ancient Buddhists saw this long before brain scans. They spoke of the 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formations and consciousness, all arising together, none of them the self. The self, they said, is like a chariot made of parts. Take the parts away and where is the chariot? It never existed as a whole, only as an appearance. But what a convincing appearance. It walks, it talks, it plans, it remembers. And yet, when one sits very still, very quiet, something shifts. The narrative slows. The sense of me starts to thin. What's left is not an absence, but a presence, spacious, aware, unconcerned with identity. And in that space, life continues. The dishes still get washed. The child still gets tucked in. The work still gets done. But without the weight. Without the burden of being someone. And strangely, what arises is kindness. Not because one should be kind, but because there's no longer anything to protect, no ego to defend, no pride to maintain, just openness, just connection. The mystic Meister Eckhart said, "The eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me." What is this eye? It's not personal. It's not limited to one face, one body. It's awareness itself, wearing different masks. And this changes everything. The stranger on the train, the enemy in the story, even the self in the mirror, they are not other. They are appearances of the same light, but the ego hates this. It wants to be unique, special, separate. It craves comparison, and in comparison it suffers. Always not enough, or always more, but never still, never whole. And so we chase, not truth, not joy, but identity. The next role, the next label, the next way to say, this is me. But every identity eventually cracks, and when it does, we panic, as if something essential has been lost. But nothing essential can be lost, only the illusion, only the costume. And when that falls away, what remains is real, quiet, steady, like the sky behind every storm. This is not nihilism. It's not despair, it's relief. To no longer have to be someone. To no longer have to prove or defend or polish the self. just to rest, just to breathe, just to be. And from that place, love flows. Not the love of possession or longing, but the love that sees clearly, that knows there is no separation, that knows there is no other, just this, just now. The final and quietest truth is this: there is no final truth, only this moment, only this flicker of being that comes and goes, without origin, without destination, like breath appearing in cold air and vanishing before it can be grasped. The mind wants something solid to end on, a conclusion, a takeaway. But reality offers none. Reality doesn't conclude, it continues. The idea of a self that finishes a journey is part of the illusion. There is no traveller, only the movement, only the river, never the raft. And yet, in this river, there is grace, not in the form of answers, but in the absence of need. When the self dissolves, the questions lose their teeth. Who am I? Becomes a soft echo, not a scream. What is my purpose? Becomes irrelevant. Because life is happening whether we define it or not. The trees are not worried about legacy. The wind is not seeking meaning. And still they move, still they sing. We are not different, but the self, terrified of insignificance, clings to stories. Grand stories, tragic stories, redemption arcs, ascension plots. The self is always either falling or rising, never still, never simply here, and yet presence needs no plot. It is enough on its own. When the striving ends, not because we have given up, but because we have seen through the chase, a strange lightness appears. A lightness that does not float away, but sinks in. A calm that is not dull but vibrant. Awareness, clear and unburdened. This is not special. It does not belong to monks or mystics or gurus. It is the birthright of anyone who stops pretending. Anyone who stops trying to be enlightened and simply notices what is already here. Even the ordinary is sacred when seen without the lens of self. The dishes glint like stars. The hands tremble with life. The silence between words becomes a symphony. And in that space, nothing needs to be fixed. Nothing needs to be changed. This doesn't mean we stop acting. It means we act without the weight of the body moves, the voice speaks, the heart opens, but no one claims it. Like wind through a flute, like light through a window, all action, no actor. This is what Zen calls no mind, not a blank state, but an ungrasping one, fully awake, fully empty, and paradoxically, fully alive. There is no self here, no watcher behind the eyes, just seeing, just flowing, just this. And still, life continues. The child cries, the email dings, the stomach hungers, but none of it belongs to anyone. It's just life, arising in awareness. Not yours, not mine, just happening. And when the illusion tries to return, as it will, gently notice it. Smile. Watch the thoughts say, "This is me." Watch the feelings demand attention. Watch the voice narrate the world again. Don't fight it, don't believe it. Just notice, just breathe, just return. Again and again. Like waves returning to shore. Like sleep arriving after long wakefulness. Gently, slowly, inevitable. This is the softest truth of all. The ego cannot hold it, but the heart can. Not the heart of romance or sentiment, but the heart of awareness. Silent, spacious, timeless. The place where nothing is missing because nothing was ever separate. And so we end without ending. Not with a conclusion, but with a disappearance. The self slips off like a coat no longer needed. And what's left is simple. Still. Whole. Not a person, not a name. Just this. Just this. The earlier tale rests now in stillness, its final words sinking into the quiet like stones, into deep water, leaving only the slow ripples of thought behind. The candle's flame sways gently, and in its light, another journey begins, softer and wider, one that will drift through the great currents of philosophy, touching the ideas that have shaped the minds of centuries. No longer bound to one story, the mind will wander across 10 of the most enduring visions of wisdom, moving slowly so that each thought has time to settle like dust on an untouched shelf. Now let us speak of the first great idea, the Socratic method. It begins not with answers but with questions, small and deliberate, placed like stones on a path to see where they lead. Socrates believed that wisdom does not arrive in the fullness of knowing, but in the humility of realizing how little is truly known. He would meet his students not with lectures, but with simple inquiries, peeling away layers of certainty to reveal the soft, uncertain core beneath. Each answer invited another question, and in this unending dance the mind was forced to see its own contradictions, to stand in the open where assumptions once sheltered it. It is a method that is less about arriving somewhere than about refining the traveller, stripping away false confidence until only the essential remains. In the glow of this idea, one begins to feel the quiet power of conversation, not as a contest to win, but as a shared search where each voice is a lantern and the road ahead is always longer than it seems. Socrates himself left no writings, trusting instead in the living exchange between minds in the way a well-placed question can echo for years inside the heart. Even now, in the silence of this night, his method remains alive. For every honest question asked without the armour of certainty is a small act of Socratic courage, a way of stepping toward truth without claiming to possess it. And perhaps this is why his voice endures, not as the keeper of answers, but as the one who teaches how to walk in their direction. The candle leans, the air shifts, and somewhere in the darkness, the next great idea waits to be called forward. Now let us turn to the next great idea, Plato's theory of forms. Imagine a world beyond sight, untouched by time, where every shape, every truth, every beauty exists in its most perfect state. Plato believed that the reality we see is only a shadow of that higher realm, that the table in front of us is but an echo of the perfect tableness that exists beyond change, beyond decay. In this vision, the physical world is a mirror clouded by imperfection, and what we call knowledge is the act of remembering what the soul has already seen before birth. He spoke of a cave where people sit chained, watching shadows on a wall, believing them to be all there is, until one escapes into the light and sees the forms directly. The journey is not easy. The eyes ache in the brightness. The heart resists the unfamiliar, and yet once truth is glimpsed, the shadows lose their hold. In the forms lies the unchanging essence of things, the perfect circle that no hand can draw, the justice that no law can fully capture, the beauty that no face can forever keep. The senses, Plato warns, can deceive. They show us many chairs, each flawed, yet through thought we can approach the single, flawless form of chairness that makes them all possible. And so the philosopher's work is to look beyond appearances, to use reason as a bridge to that higher reality, to anchor the soul in what cannot fade. It is a comforting thought that somewhere there is a place where nothing breaks, nothing dies, nothing loses its shape, that all goodness and truth are preserved whole. But it is also a demanding thought, for it asks the mind to see the world not as an end, but as a clue, a path, a whisper of something greater. In this way, every ordinary thing becomes a signpost, every imperfect moment a reminder that perfection exists elsewhere, drawing us on. And perhaps in quiet moments like this, we can almost sense it, not with the eyes, but with the still part of the soul that recognizes what it once knew. The candle burns steadily, casting its own shadows on the wall, and one wonders which world this light belongs to, the one of change or the one of forms. Perhaps both. Perhaps every flicker is an invitation to turn toward the light. Now let us speak of Aristotle's virtue ethics, a vision of the good life not built on rigid rules or fleeting pleasures, but on the cultivation of character. Aristotle saw human life as a movement toward eudaimonia, a word often softened into happiness, but more deeply meaning human flourishing, the full flowering of one's nature. This is not a state one stumbles into by fortune, but a way of living shaped by countless choices, each one forming the habits that become the soul's architecture. Virtue, to Aristotle, is the balance between extremes, the golden mean between excess and deficiency. Courage lies between recklessness and cowardice. Generosity lies between wastefulness and stinginess. Honesty lies between boastfulness and self-deprecation. These are not mathematical midpoints, but living balances, different for each person, found through experience, reflection, and the slow refining of judgment. One becomes virtuous as one learns to play an instrument, not by reading notes alone, but by practice, by the feel of the strings, by mistakes that teach the hand where to rest. It is a philosophy that respects action, for knowing the good is not enough if one does not also do the good. And yet action must be guided by reason, for virtue is no accident. It is a harmony between thought and deed, where impulse is tempered by wisdom. In Aristotle's view, the virtuous person does the right thing not through struggle, but with a kind of ease as a skilled craftsman moves through his work with steady hands. Such ease is not born of laziness, but of long effort made natural. The world in this light is not a place to endure until some better life begins, but the very field in which the soul's excellence is cultivated. Every encounter, every challenge, every moment of choice is an opportunity to strengthen the fibre of one's being. And so, the good life is not defined by wealth, power, or comfort, but by the steady accumulation of virtues, until the self stands as a well-built structure, able to weather the winds of fortune without collapse. In this way, happiness is not a prize, but the natural radiance of a well-shaped soul, a light that does not flicker with the passing of days. The candle's flame bends slightly in a whisper of unseen air, and one is reminded that balance, like virtue, is not stillness, but a constant adjustment, a living alignment with the good. Now let us turn to the thought of Descartes and the words that have echoed through centuries. Cogito, ergo sum, I think therefore I am. It is a phrase born not from pride, but from doubt so deep it sought to strip away everything that could possibly be questioned, leaving only what could not be denied. Descartes imagined himself sweeping the mind clean of all assumption, pulling away the familiar scaffolding of belief until he stood alone in a vast space where nothing felt certain. Could the senses be trusted? They had deceived before. Could memories be trusted? They could be illusions. Could the body itself be trusted? Perhaps it was a dream, a trick, a fleeting projection. And yet, in the very act of doubting, one thing stood firm. There must be something that doubts. Thought itself became the bedrock, the one point that could not be faked or stolen. If thinking was happening, then something existed to do the thinking. This was not the end of his journey, but the first firm stone on which to build. From here, Descartes sought to rebuild the house of knowledge, brick by brick, each step tested for certainty. He wished for clarity as bright as geometry, truths so undeniable they could support all others. His method was deliberate, patient, as if sharpening a blade to cut away falsehood. And yet, there is something quietly human in the idea that the first certainty we can hold is the awareness of our own awareness, the strange fact that consciousness can turn inward and see itself. In the stillness of night, this feels less like a cold proof and more like a small ember glowing in the dark, a reminder that no matter how uncertain the world becomes, the flame of thought still burns. It is a solitary comfort, one that exists even when stripped of names, possessions, histories, even when all that remains is the bare knowing that we are here, now, thinking. Descartes' thought also whispers of the responsibility that comes with such certainty. If the self is known before all else, then it becomes the lens through which the world is built. A clear mind builds a clear life. A mind clouded with haste or fear builds a world that feels the same. To begin with, I think, is also to admit that the quality of thought matters, that the architecture of our inner world shapes the outer. The candle beside him might flicker, casting shifting shadows, but the fact of its light is undeniable. So too is the mind. Shadows may move across it, illusions may play on its surface, but the fact of its shining cannot be erased. In this way, cogito, ergo sum, is not a shout of triumph, but a steady breath in the silence, the quiet voice that remains when all other voices have been questioned away. It is the ground beneath the feet when the fog hides everything else, the one certainty from which all other certainties might grow. And perhaps, in the hours before sleep, when the body lies still and thought drifts, it is enough to hold this single truth without reaching for more, that in the act of thinking, of doubting, of wondering, there is existence, and in that existence, there is the beginning of all understanding. Now let us move to Kant's categorical imperative, a moral compass not drawn from desire or consequence, but from duty itself, pure and unbending. Kant asked what it would mean to act in such a way that one's choices could be made into universal law, binding for all in all places, at all times. He sought a morality that stood above preference, stronger than impulse, untouched by the shifting tides of personal gain. Imagine pausing before each act to ask, if everyone did this, could the world still stand? If the answer is no, the act must be set aside, however tempting, however small. This is the first face of the imperative, a rule that turns the mirror outward to humanity as a whole, asking the self to see its choices not as private shadows, but as patterns in a greater weave. The second face is equally stern, yet equally luminous. Treat every person as an end in themselves, never merely as a means. In this, Kant draws a line against using others as tools for one's own purposes, however noble the excuse. Each person is a whole world, not a rung on a ladder, and to honour that is to honour the dignity of reason itself. The beauty of this thought lies in its symmetry, one's own freedom bound only by the freedom of all others, the moral law arising not from command, but from the structure of thought that all rational beings share. In Kant's view, morality is not a gift from heaven nor a contract with society, but something woven into the very capacity to reason, a truth that would shine even in a universe empty of gods. And yet, he admits, to follow it is no easy task. Desire pulls like wind, fear presses like weight, and the clarity of the imperative can feel cold against the warmth of inclination. But for Kant, it is in that cold clarity that moral worth is found. For to act rightly when it costs nothing is no great proof of virtue, but to act rightly against one's own advantage is the mark of a will aligned with the moral law. There is a certain quiet majesty in this view, the thought that even in the smallest decision one participates in a law as vast and impartial as the night sky, each act a star in a constellation too large for one life to see whole. The candle on the desk leans lower, its flame steady despite the draught, and one is reminded that light does not ask whether it is convenient to shine, it simply fulfills its nature. In this, Kant's imperative finds its living image, a steady flame guided not by whim or reward, but by the form of its own being. Now let us drift into Nietzsche's vision of the will to power, a force he saw not as the hunger for mere control over others, but as the deep, restless impulse within all living things to grow, to expand, to overcome the boundaries of what they are. For Nietzsche, life itself was a movement toward more life, a ceaseless reaching, like roots pressing through stone, or rivers carving valleys over centuries. The will to power was not simply ambition, nor the shallow thirst for domination, but the inner current that drives the seed to become a tree, the artist to create beyond exhaustion, the thinker to break the limits of inherited truth. In his eyes, Existence was not content to remain still. It surged forward in infinite forms, testing itself, reshaping itself, becoming more than it was. Even suffering could be part of this will, for struggle was not a mark of weakness, but a forge where strength was tempered. To embrace the will to power was to see life not as a series of obstacles, to endure until rest, but as a great arena in which one's being was sharpened through challenge, conflict, and creation. He warned against the life lived too safely, for in the shelter from hardship, the will could wither, becoming timid and pale. Better, he thought, to step into the storm and find in it the raw material from which to build oneself anew. It was this idea that fed his vision of the Übermensch, the one who creates their own values, standing beyond the dictates of the herd, shaping a self as an artist shapes stone, not with submission, but with the courage to carve. Such a life was not without cost. It demanded the abandonment of illusions that comfort but weaken, the acceptance that meaning is not given but made. Yet in this creation, the will to power finds its highest form, not in ruling over others, but in ruling over the self, in mastering the chaos within and turning it toward a work of art that is one's own existence. The night deepens as the thought settles, and one can feel in its quiet insistence the truth Nietzsche sensed, that even in stillness, the will stirs like embers beneath ash, waiting for the breath that will bring them back into flame. Now let us turn to the idea of utilitarianism, the quiet yet weighty belief that the right action is the one that brings the greatest happiness to the greatest number. It is a thought that moves like a measuring hand over every choice, weighing pleasure against pain, joy against sorrow, as if morality itself could be shaped into a delicate balance. Jeremy Bentham spoke of it first in clear, almost mathematical terms, imagining each decision as a calculation, a sum of benefit and harm. John Stuart Mill refined it, reminding that not all pleasures are equal, that the delight of the mind and the depth of the heart stand above the fleeting gratifications of the body. In this way, the principle grows from mere arithmetic into a philosophy of care, one that asks not simply, "What do I want?" but "What will ease the burdens of all?" And yet, there is a softness in its ambition, for it does not dream of perfect worlds or flawless virtue, only of the steady increase of well-being, the lessening of needless suffering. In the quiet of night, such a thought has a certain tenderness, a recognition that life is already heavy and that the best we can do is to make it lighter where we can. But utilitarianism is not without its shadows. To weigh happiness is to sometimes choose between lives, to accept that what benefits the many may wound the few, and this calculation can cut deeply into the fabric of moral certainty. It demands a coolness of mind that can seem at odds with the warmth of compassion, and yet it is driven by compassion's root desire, that pain be less and joy be more. One might picture it as a lantern carried through a dark field, its light cast not just for the carrier, but for all who walk nearby. Each act becomes a ripple in a still pond, spreading outward in rings unseen, touching lives never met. To live by such a rule is to be always aware of these ripples, to choose with an eye not on the self alone, but on the widening circle of effect. In this way, the smallest kindness becomes great, and the smallest cruelty becomes grave. The candle's flame dips, sways, then steadies again, and one can almost feel in that fragile steadiness the essence of this thought, that the good is not a single blaze, but the gentle work of keeping the light burning for as many as it can reach. Now let us drift into the realm of existentialism, a philosophy that stands in the quiet space between the vast indifference of the universe and the fragile beating of a human heart. Kierkegaard spoke of the leap, the choice to believe or to act in the face of uncertainty, while Sartre declared that existence precedes essence, that we are not born with a fixed nature, but must carve our own from the raw stone of being. In this vision, there is no script, no eternal blueprint waiting to be discovered, only the open field of freedom, both exhilarating and heavy with the weight of responsibility. For to be free is also to be without excuse. Every choice, even the refusal to choose, shapes the meaning of one's life. Camus saw this clearly in the figure of Sisyphus, condemned to push the boulder without end, yet free to find joy in the act itself, to turn the burden into a form of defiance. In existentialism, the meaning of life is not given but made, shaped moment by moment in the furnace of decision. It is a philosophy that does not shy from the darkness. It asks us to stand within it and light our own small flame, knowing it may be the only one. This freedom can be dizzying, for the mind longs for certainty, for a map, for a guiding star that will not fade. Yet existentialism whispers that no such star is fixed, that we must chart the heavens ourselves, and that in doing so we become the cartographers of our own reality. Even despair in this light can be transformed, for when nothing is predetermined, every step becomes a declaration, every act a creation. The candle on the table burns without asking why. Its purpose is found in the burning itself. So too with life. Its meaning may be nothing more than the living of it, and yet in that simple truth lies a strange and unshakable dignity. To live without guarantees is to walk a path that is fully one's own, and in that ownership there is both solitude and strength. Perhaps this is why, in the quiet hours, existentialism feels less like a burden and more like a permission, the permission to be, to choose, to shape, and to stand as the sole author of one's fleeting but luminous story. Now let us move into the idea of the social contract, the quiet yet binding thread that weaves individuals into the fabric of a society. Hobbes spoke of a world before such a contract, a state of nature where life, though free, was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, where each lived by strength or cunning, and safety was a fragile dream. To escape this chaos, people, he said, surrendered certain freedoms, placing them in the hands of a sovereign power in exchange for order and protection. Locke's vision was gentler, imagining the contract as a guardian of life, liberty, and property, with the right to replace rulers who broke its trust. Rousseau heard another note entirely, speaking of the general will, the shared interest that rises above individual desires, the possibility of a collective self that acts not to oppress but to free. In each telling, the contract is not a paper in a drawer, but a living agreement, renewed in every act of cooperation, every law obeyed or challenged, every moment where self-interest bends toward the common good. It is unseen yet everywhere, shaping the streets we walk, the words we speak, the trust with which we open our doors at night. Without it, the world would return to the scattered silence of fear, where each step must be guarded and every stranger is a threat. Yet with it comes the weight of obligation, for to be part of a society is to bear the responsibility of maintaining its justice, to give as well as to take, to remember that rights are not solitary possessions, but shared inheritances. The candle burns lower, its light touching the edges of the room, and one feels in that circle the shape of the contract itself, an agreement to keep the flame alive so that all may see. But contracts, like flames, are delicate. They require care, they demand the tending of truth, the protection of fairness, the vigilance against those who would twist the common good to private ends. And so, to honour the social contract is not only to live within its safety, but to guard its spirit, to ensure that the promise made long ago in silence still holds in the lives of those who have never spoken it aloud. Now let us wander into the ancient current of the Tao, the Way, the quiet path spoken of in the old verses of Lao Tzu, a path not built but discovered, not forced but followed. The Tao is the rhythm beneath all rhythms, the flowing order that needs no command, the movement of clouds and rivers, the unfurling of leaves, the turning of the seasons, all in harmony, without hurry. To walk with the Tao is to let go of the restless urge to control, to see that the world shapes itself without the heavy hand of constant interference. The sages called this Wu Wei, effortless action. Not idleness, but the art of doing in a way that does not fight the current. It is the tree bending in the wind rather than breaking, the stream finding its way, a round stone without force. The Tao is not a destination, but the living present. Not a doctrine, but the quiet awareness that each moment holds its own completeness. It asks no oaths, no declarations, only the soft attentiveness that notices the pattern already unfolding. One who follows the Tao is like water, yielding yet unstoppable, clear yet deep, seeking the low places others avoid, nourishing without demanding. This way of being does not deny desire, but it does not cling to it. It does not refuse action, but it does not wrestle with it. In this light, ambition is not abandoned, but transformed, becoming less about climbing and more about flowing, less about conquest and more about harmony. The candle flickers with a small shift in the air, its flames swaying but not going out. A small lesson in the Tao itself, movement without loss, change without destruction. To understand the Tao is to see that control is an illusion, that the greatest strength often lies in yielding, that the world's deepest wisdom moves quietly, without announcement, shaping mountains and lives alike in its patient course. And so the way is always here, as near as the breath, as silent as the stars, waiting only for the stillness in which it can be heard. Now let us drift into David Hume's quiet yet unsettling thought, the problem of induction, a gentle unthreading of the trust we place in the patterns of the world. From childhood, we are taught to expect that the sun will rise tomorrow because it rose today, that bread will nourish because it always has, that dropped stones will fall because they always do. But Hume asked, how can we truly know this? We have seen these patterns repeat, yes, but repetition is not proof. We believe the future will mirror the past, not because of reason, but because of habit, a habit so deep it feels like certainty. We watch cause and effect as though they are bound together by necessity, yet what we actually see is only one thing following another, again and again, until the mind weaves its own invisible thread between them. We never witness the binding itself, only the sequence, only the rhythm. In this way, our confidence in tomorrow rests on an assumption we cannot prove, and yet cannot live without. Hume did not mean to strip the world of trust, but to show that our trust is a creature of the mind, not the logic of the universe. This thought can feel like standing at the edge of a vast plain at night, knowing the path forward is only lit by the small lantern of memory, and the rest is darkness we simply step into, believing the ground will still be there. The beauty of Hume's insight lies in its humility, for it reminds us that knowledge is not as solid as we wish it to be, that certainty is a quiet agreement between experience and expectation. Even the candle beside us burns with the same illusion. We expect it will keep burning in the next moment, but this is only because it has burned in the last. Perhaps it will, perhaps it won't, but our life moves forward as though it must. In this space between proof and habit, between knowledge and trust, Hume leaves us not with despair, but with the awareness that the mind's faith in the future is one of its most fragile and necessary acts. Now let us wander into the old and tempting vision of hedonism, the belief that pleasure is the highest good, that the measure of a life is found in the fullness of its delights. To the ancient Greeks, it was not a call to endless indulgence, but a search for the truest forms of happiness, the kind that endure rather than vanish in the aftertaste of excess. Epicurus spoke of it as the art of seeking pleasure wisely, of choosing those joys that do not bring pain in their shadow, of cultivating the simple satisfactions that need no wealth or conquest to sustain them. For him, bread and water could be a feast if taken with peace of mind, and friendship, quiet and deep, was a treasure greater than gold. In this light, pleasure was not the frantic grasping at sensation, but the gentle shaping of life, to avoid unnecessary suffering, to find contentment in what is near at hand. Yet hedonism holds a mirror to a truth many resist. That pain is the weight we seek to set down, and joy is the lightness we seek to carry. To follow this path is to learn the difference between what pleases in the moment and what nourishes across time, to see that the richest pleasures are often the softest ones, like the warmth of the sun on closed eyelids or the sound of rain against a window. But there is danger here too, for the pursuit of pleasure can so easily drift into a hunger that is never sated, a chasing of peaks that leaves one hollow between them. This is why the wiser hedonists speak of balance, of knowing when to stop, of savouring rather than consuming. The candle burns with a steady glow, giving its light freely but within the limits of its wax. It does not seek to burn faster, for that would be to end itself. So too with pleasure, when it is taken in measure, it sustains; when taken in greed, it destroys. Hedonism, at its truest, is the art of knowing the difference. Now let us move into the deep and endless question of determinism and free will, the tension between the chains of cause and the dream of choice. Determinism whispers that every action, every thought, every breath is the inevitable result of all that came before, that the universe is a vast, unbroken chain stretching backward to the first movement and forward to the last, each link forged by the one before it. In this view, the moment of decision is not a birth but an unfolding, like a seed opening because it must, like the tide rising because it is pulled. If the mind is shaped by genes, by upbringing, by the precise arrangement of atoms and events, then perhaps even the belief in freedom is simply another link in the chain. And yet, against this, the feeling of choice rises like a stubborn flame, the sense of standing at a crossroads, of being able to step left or right, to speak or remain silent, to act or to refrain. Free will insists that within the machinery there is a space, however small, where the self can push against the weight of what has been and make something new. Some see the two not as enemies but as different lights on the same river, that perhaps the current is fixed, yet the way one moves within it is one's own, that freedom may lie not in altering the flow, but in choosing how to meet it. Others suggest that even if all is determined, the experience of choosing is real enough to live by, for a life lived as if one is free is shaped differently than one lived in resignation. The candle on the table burns because the match was struck. The match was struck because the hand moved. The hand moved because of thoughts. The thoughts arose because of other moments, each leading to this small circle of light. Whether this flame was inevitable from the birth of the stars or lit by a free and sudden act may never be known. Perhaps it is in the mystery between these two that human life unfolds, a dance of necessity and possibility, where even if the steps are written, the dancer still moves with grace. Now let us step into the quiet puzzle of the ship of Theseus, an ancient question that drifts between the harbours of identity and change. The story is simple. A ship preserved in honour of a hero is kept seaworthy for centuries by replacing its parts as they decay. First a plank, then a mast, then the sails, until every single piece is new. And so the question arises, when all the original parts are gone, is it still the same ship? At first it feels like a trick of language, but the longer one lingers, the deeper it pulls. For if the ship is not the same, then at what moment did it cease to be itself? Was it when the first plank was replaced or the last? And if it is the same, then what makes it so? The form, the function, the name, or something else entirely? The puzzle grows stranger still when one imagines the discarded pieces gathered and rebuilt into a ship identical to the original. Which then is the true ship of Theseus, the one with the unbroken history or the one made of the original wood? The candle flame quivers slightly, and one realizes that the question is not only about ships but about people, for our bodies too are replaced piece by piece as the years turn, cells dying and being born, memories fading and shifting, beliefs evolving, faces changing. Yet we say without hesitation, I am still myself. Perhaps identity is not the matter from which we are made, but the continuity of the journey, the thread of experience and memory woven through time. Or perhaps we are, like the ship, something that both changes completely and remains somehow whole, our essence not fixed but a living thing, shaped and reshaped by the tides of existence. In this way, the ship of Theseus is less a riddle to be solved than a mirror, quietly reflecting the mystery of what it means to remain oneself while becoming someone new. Now let us rest within the strange and quiet terrain of absurdism, the recognition, as Albert Camus saw it, that human beings are creatures who seek meaning in a universe that offers none in return. The mind yearns for clarity, for a grand design, for a purpose written in the stars, yet when it looks outward, it meets only silence, a vast and unbroken stillness. This is the absurd, not chaos, not hostility, but the endless tension between the hunger for meaning and the absence of it. Many, upon feeling this weight, rush to escape it, turning to faith, ideology, or distraction, anything to stitch a pattern into the blank cloth of existence. But Camus suggested another way, to face the absurd without flinching, to accept that life is without ultimate explanation, and yet to live it fully, intensely, as though the lack of meaning were not a prison, but a kind of freedom. In his image of Sisyphus pushing the stone, he saw not a figure crushed by futility, but one who, in embracing the endless task, finds his own victory. If there is no higher plan, then each moment becomes the canvas, and we, the painters of its fleeting colours. The candle's flame, which will inevitably burn down to nothing, still gives its light in this moment, and that light is enough. Absurdism asks not for resignation, but for defiance, not the bitter defiance of rage, but the quiet defiance of joy, the choice to smile in the face of the void. It whispers that life's worth is not hidden behind some distant curtain to be drawn back at the end, but here, in the very act of living, in the taste of water, in the warmth of a shared glance, in the sound of wind moving through leaves at night. And so, one learns to walk through the silence with open eyes, to push the stone with steady hands, knowing that the meaning one seeks may never come, and yet finding, in the seeking itself, something that feels like meaning after all. Now let us enter the shadowed depths of Plato's allegory of the cave, a vision of human understanding drawn in the soft charcoal of myth. Imagine a group of people who have lived their whole lives chained in darkness, their faces turned toward a wall, able to see only the flickering shadows cast by objects passing before a fire behind them. To these prisoners, the shadows are the only reality, the shapes the only truth, for they have never seen the objects themselves, nor the fire, nor the world beyond the cave. Then imagine that one prisoner is freed, pulled into the light, stumbling and blinded at first. For the truth is painful when the eyes have known only darkness. Slowly, shapes emerge. The fire, the path upward, and finally, beyond the cave, the vast and radiant world under the open sky. Trees, water, sunlight, stars. In that moment, the freed one understands that all they had believed was but a pale reflection of something greater. Yet the allegory does not end there, for the freed prisoner feels the pull to return, to descend again into the cave and tell the others of what lies beyond. But the others, unaccustomed to such talk, may not believe, may even resist, for the comfort of familiar shadows can feel safer than the blinding strangeness of truth. Plato's vision is not only about knowledge, but about the soul's journey from illusion to reality and the cost of awakening. For to see the light is also to know the darkness for what it is, and to live with the burden of both. The candle on the table flickers, casting soft shadows on the wall, and one can feel the cave in them, the way perception can be bound by what the senses allow, the way truth often waits beyond the frame of sight. The allegory whispers that each life is a kind of cave, and that to seek wisdom is to climb toward the light, even if the ascent is slow, even if the sun's brightness brings tears, even if the ones left below cannot follow. Now let us move into the still centre of Aristotle's golden mean, the gentle balance he saw as the heart of virtue, the narrow path between the cliffs of excess and deficiency. For Aristotle, every virtue is a midpoint, not an exact line drawn in stone, but a living balance that shifts with circumstance and person. Courage lies between cowardice and recklessness, generosity between miserliness and waste, humility between arrogance and self-abasement. It is not the avoidance of extremes for their own sake, but the seeking of the place where equality is at its most fitting, most human, most whole. This balance is not static, for life moves, and with it the measure of the mean. What is courage in one moment may be recklessness in another. What is restraint today may be cowardice tomorrow. The golden mean asks for a constant listening, a steady attunement to the harmony of the situation, as a musician adjusts each note to the flow of the music. In this way, virtue becomes less a rigid rule and more a craft, something shaped with patience and care, a skill honed in the quiet decisions that fill the days. Yet to live in balance is not to live without passion. Aristotle did not call for the dull flattening of all feeling, but for the full flowering of what is good in its right place and measure. The candle burns at such a mean. Too small a flame, and it will fade into darkness. Too large, and it will consume itself. But here it glows steadily, giving light and warmth without waste. The golden mean is a reminder that wisdom often lives, not in the loud gesture or the final extreme, but in the quiet middle, where the forces of life meet and steady each other. And so, to walk in virtue is to walk that narrow yet shifting road, feeling the weight of each step, listening for the place where one stands in harmony with both the self and the world. Now let us drift into the quiet logic of the principle of sufficient reason, the thought that nothing exists without a reason why it is so and not otherwise. Leibniz shaped it into a guiding light for the mind, a soft but unyielding demand that every fact, every event, every shadow and star carries within it the thread of its own explanation. To accept this principle is to believe that the world is not scattered chaos, but an ordered tapestry, each stitch bound to the next by the necessity, of course, the inevitability of reason. Yet this is not only a law for the scientist or the philosopher, it is the silent pull that makes a child ask why again and again, the impulse to peer behind the curtain of the obvious, to lift the stone and see what lives beneath. It whispers that no leaf falls without a cause, no thought rises in the mind without its roots, no flame burns without the marriage of air and spark. The candle before us is here, because the wax was shaped, the wick was set, the match was struck. The air allowed it to live, each step a reason, each reason part of a longer chain that winds back beyond sight. But the principle carries its own shadows, for if everything must have a reason, then what reason is there for the whole of existence itself? What stands at the end of the chain, giving reason to all, yet needing none? Leibniz answered with the idea of a necessary being, something whose reason for existing lies in its own nature, something that simply is. Others see in this the limits of reason itself, a place where the mind meets the horizon and can go no further. Still, the principle remains a lantern in the dark, guiding thought through the tangled forest of causes, reminding us that to understand is to search for the thread that binds each moment to another, even if in the end that thread disappears into the silence from which all things come. Now let us sink into the shadowed waters of nihilism, the unsettling recognition that life may hold no inherent meaning, no ultimate purpose written into its fabric. The word carries the chill of emptiness, yet its roots lie not in the desire to destroy, but in the willingness to strip away illusions, to stand before the world without the shelter of comforting fictions. Nietzsche spoke of it as both a danger and a beginning. For when the old beliefs crumble, when the foundations that once seemed eternal turn to dust, a vast space opens. Some see in that space only despair, a void into which all values collapse, a darkness in which the self drifts without anchor. Yet others find in it a strange liberation, the freedom to shape meaning rather than receive it, to become the author rather than the subject of life's story. Nihilism does not erase the sun or silence the wind. It changes only the frame in which they're seen. The candle's flame still burns, though it owes its light to nothing beyond itself. And in that self-contained glow, there is a quiet beauty. To live without inherent meaning is not to live without value. It is to understand that value is made, not found, woven from choice, from love, from the small acts of creation that give colour to the days. The danger comes when the void is mistaken for an end rather than a beginning, when the absence of given purpose is read as the absence of all purpose. But for those who can bear the weight of it, nihilism becomes not a sentence, but a horizon, a wide and open space where the individual stands in the stillness and begins to speak meaning into the silence. It is a call to live, not because life is guaranteed to matter, but because it can be made to matter. And in that making lies a kind of quiet triumph. Now let us step into the looping corridor of Nietzsche's eternal recurrence, the thought experiment that bends time into a circle and asks the soul to dwell within it. Imagine that one night, in the stillness of solitude, a voice comes to whisper that every moment of life, every breath, every joy and sorrow will return to you again and again, not once, not twice, but endlessly, exactly as it has unfolded before. Each gesture repeated, each word spoken again, each glance, each mistake, each triumph, forever. At first the thought may feel like a weight, an unbearable burden, the idea that even the smallest pains will be lived not only once but countless times. Yet Nietzsche posed it not as a curse but as a test, a mirror held to the heart to ask, if this were true, could one embrace it? Could one say yes to the totality of existence, to the light and the shadow, the sweetness and the bitterness, as if they were inseparable notes in the same music? To live as though the eternal recurrence were real is to live without reservation, to choose each act as if it were to echo across eternity, to stand before life and affirm it wholly without wishing a single moment away. The candle before us burns with this same silent repetition. Each flicker is both new and the same, a dance of light that will appear and vanish in countless forms, yet always aflame. The idea does not demand belief in a literal cycle. It asks instead whether one can meet life with such depth of acceptance that even if all returned forever, nothing in it would be denied. It is a call to live so completely that time itself, in its endless turning, would become not a prison, but a celebration, a circle one would step into again and again, not in resignation, but in joy.